biggest news this week involved the COVID-19 pandemic, with the US Energy Department concluding that the COVID-19 pandemic that stopped the world most likely arose from a lab leak in Wuhan. That's according to a classified intelligence report recently provided to the White House and key members of Congress. Yes, once again, Donald Trump was right almost 3 years ago.
And my question is, have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And I think that the World Health Organization should be ashamed of themselves, because they're like the public relations agency for China. And this country pays them almost $500 million a year, and China pays them $38 million a year. And whether it's a lot or more, it doesn't matter. It's still, they shouldn't be making excuses when people make horrible mistakes, especially mistakes that are causing hundreds of thousands of people around the world to die.
Now let's bring in Sky News contributor Kosha Gator to discuss the day's big stories, and that one is it's a big one. I mean, it's one that has been talked about, hinted at. It was almost considered a wild conspiracy theory, something that tinfoil hat wearing crazies would contemplate. But it was always a plausible explanation, given there is a massive clinic in Wuhan that studies coronaviruses. And where did coronavirus start? But in Wuhan. And then you hear stories like, well, the wet market that was blamed for the outbreak didn't even sell bats. So there was just so much there. And yet, because Trump said it, there was this overwhelming eagerness to discredit the theory.
So I think there's 4 takeaways from this. So one is the knee-jerk reaction. Anything Trump says, just automatically media, very uncritically thinking people just rush into the opposite. The other, I think, is the opacity of government and just why we don't trust them, because they came out with a pretty mealy-mouthed thing where they're admitting it, but the Department of Energy, but they say it was with low confidence. 4 other agencies who will not be identified are coming out and saying, no, we still think it's a wet market. So even when they admit it, they want to obfuscate it and create enough murkiness.
It's the most likely scenario, but they won't commit to it.
They won't commit to it. Too much hedging. And that's just something that people are really increasingly fed up with, because there's no accountability. And I think the other thing is the China-U.S. point, which Trump mentioned there. He zeroed in on the World Health Organization. But more broadly, it just shows how unserious the U.S. and the West is and how they're dealing with China more broadly versus, China. It always feels like they're playing chess while we're playing checkers. And I think the last reason is political, where the Republicans who want to pursue that questioning and that probing into gain-of-function research and U.S. taxpayer dollars getting funneled into Wuhan and this lab through cutout agencies in the middle, again, obfuscating transparency. This breeds a little bit of oxygen into that. So expect to see Congress, I think, using this and latching onto this as they continue.
Oh, I think people will be demanding a full investigation to precisely where that money went, if it had any contribution to this. And what really worries me more so than everything you've just mentioned is the way science has been corrupted by politics, because it wasn't just the politicians, the media, the political pundits who came out against this as soon as Trump or any member of his administration mentioned the lab leak theory. It was the scientific community who, yes, they've all mainly done U-turns, and the lab leak theory went from being a crazy conspiracy theory to being, a rational explanation to now the most likely explanation in the eyes of many scientists. But that initial reaction from so many in the scientific community, I think, really discredits those experts, and probably explains why trust in the expert class has diminished throughout the pandemic.
It's a true point, and especially science. That's probably the saddest part in this, where trust in various institutions has been diminishing for a long time. Media, government, we've talked about that. But now science, doctors, like so many doctors sort of just towed the party line, and they're understanding it because they were being banned or, sued or fined for not complying. But that was really, really sad, where this government intervention of masking and vaccinating and all that came between individuals and doctors. Scientific journalists completely showed no critical thinking and latched onto that. And I think, the mask has been lifted, pun intended.
Yeah, the mask has been lifted. And you mentioned journalists, the fact checkers, the so-called fact checkers, which are quite often just activists. Let's not forget what they contributed to this. This is the Washington Post. Glenn Kessler, the resident fact checker, mocking anybody floating the lab leak theory. He is having a go at Ted Cruz. And we have plenty of naysayers locally too, particularly from the ABC. But I've got to say, this Energy Department conclusion that COVID most likely began from a lab leak, I think it really also vindicates much of the reporting you've seen on Sky News, because we had the documentary headed by Shari Marks, and again, the ABC attacked that. They did not like that. Let's have a listen to ABC host Paul Barry.
So how likely is it that the virus escaped from that Chinese lab? Well, in short, it's not.
COVID-19 did not come from lab.
The evidence is overwhelming.
Last month, 2 studies published in Science magazine, after 5 months of peer review, identified the wild animal trade at the Wuhan wet market as ground zero for the COVID outbreak. The siren has definitely sounded on the lab leak theory. He hoped the new evidence would correct the false record that the virus came from a lab. Meanwhile, Sky News host Gary Hardgrave had his own crazy theory about the global health emergency.
This thing has been cooked up, it's pretty evident, cooked up by some mad scientists in China. I don't care what anyone says.
Yes, I think we'll be hearing a little bit more about that in the coming days on Sky News. A little bit of humble pie needs to be eaten there indeed.